49-year-old Georgy Markov was living in London and working as a reporter for the BBC. On the morning of September 7th, he began his typical commute into work. It had started to rain, and Georgy did not have an umbrella. He decided it was not worth it, and so he began looking for a bus stop, and he found one pretty quickly. As he stood there waiting, he suddenly felt a shooting pain in the back of his right thigh, and instinctively, without even knowing what it was, he just reached down and grabbed his leg, but he couldn't feel anything, and then he tried to kind of look around and look down at his leg, but it was just too crowded around him. And so he's standing there wondering what could have caused this pain. And the only things he could think of were, maybe it's some sort of bug that bit him. There weren't that many scenarios that made sense to him. The bus arrived, and by the time the bus pulled up in front of his office building, Georgy had effectively forgotten about this pain in his leg. But when he got up to his actual desk and sat down on his chair, it sent that shooting pain into his leg, and immediately he noticed it. And so Georgy stood up immediately, and he's grabbing at the back of his leg, and so he's standing there wondering what he should do, but then he tells himself, you're overthinking it, this has got to be something minor, I need to get to work. By the second half of the day, in the early afternoon, the pain in his leg had become so excruciating that Georgy was literally gritting his teeth and sweating profusely in order to try to ignore the pain, but at some point it just became too much. He couldn't focus on work, and so he stood up, he left his desk, and he walked down the hall, and he went into the single stall bathroom. And once he went inside and he shut the door behind him, he pulled his pants down and turned around and looked in the mirror, and right away there was a little bit of a relief there, because what he saw was a little bit of redness, a little bit of swelling, but nothing significant. Whatever it was definitely minor, at least in Georgy's mind. He leaves the bathroom and goes back to his desk. When he finally got home again and walked through the door, Georgy's wife looked at him and was like, what's wrong with you? He was so pale, he was sweating profusely, he looked awful, and so he told her about what had happened with his leg, and he was still trying to kind of write it off, but she told him, Georgy, you are sick, there's something wrong, we have to go to the hospital right now. They made their way over to the emergency room at the hospital, and a doctor pulled Georgy into an exam room, and he asked Georgy to stand up, pull his pants down so the doctor can get a look. As the doctor bends down and begins looking at the back of his thigh, Georgy kind of turns around and looks down, and he's shocked at what he sees. It's obvious that the swelling and redness on the back of his leg has grown exponentially. It looks totally horrible. The doctor stands up and looks puzzled and tells Georgy, hold on a minute, I need somebody else to get a look at this. And so the doctor goes out into the main hall. He comes back with another doctor. They stand up and they walk around and they say, okay, this is going to sound totally weird, but when you were at the bus stop, before you felt the pain in your leg, was anyone around you holding a snake or a reptile? The mark on the back of your leg looks exactly like a venomous bite. So Georgy's like, no, I didn't see anyone with snakes or reptiles. There was nothing out of the ordinary about what was happening around me when I felt this pain in my leg. And so the doctors would tell Georgy that, they didn't really know what was going on with his leg. And so the best thing to do here is just to admit him to the hospital. And right away, the nurses and doctors began administering different combinations of medicines and treatments to try to lower the swelling and the pain in his leg. But it just seemed like nothing was working. And so all night, his condition seemed to get worse, not better. And then the next day when he woke up, his leg was much, much worse. It was extremely swollen, and Georgy himself was also beginning to lose touch with reality. He had become convinced that someone had tried to kill him, and that was why he was so sick. And this delusion of his got so extreme that he was afraid of his doctors and nurses. By the next day, Georgy's condition overall had become critical. He was very clearly on the brink of death, and his mind was effectively gone. But the doctors and the nurses really had no idea what was going on with him, and so there was nothing they could do to help him. And then on the last day he was in the hospital, Georgy would die. His body just shut down. Given the strangeness of Georgy's death, his body was sent for an autopsy. During the autopsy, the coroner made a surprising discovery. Buried in the back of his right leg, right underneath the site that was where he felt the pain, was this little piece of metal. It was so small, the coroner actually almost didn't see it. But when he did see it, he put it under the microscope, and what he saw was this obviously man-made metallic disc that had these two small reservoirs drilled into it. And so they sent this disc off for further testing, and what they discovered was there was ricin residue inside of those two reservoirs. Ricin is an extremely powerful poison, and the symptoms of ricin poisoning often look like the symptoms of other diseases or illnesses, and so it's very difficult to diagnose. Ricin is a very popular poison for assassinations, and the belief is that that is exactly what happened to Georgie. He was assassinated. But to this day, we don't actually know who assassinated him. However, the running theory is that Georgie, who was a reporter for the BBC, he covered politics, and he often spoke very critically about the Soviet Union. And so this theory goes that the Soviet Union's intelligence agency, known as the KGB, they assassinated Georgie for what he was writing about. Adding credence to this theory, a former KGB officer named Oleg Kalugin claimed that he oversaw the assassination program that targeted Georgy Markov. According to Oleg, those little metallic discs that had the ricin inside of them, they were actually covered with a thin layer of wax, and only when this disc had been placed inside of the target's body would their body heat melt that wax layer off, exposing the poison, and then their target would die several days later, as Georgie did. However, Oleg's story, despite being as compelling as it was, didn't have any hard proof to back it up. And so to this day, there has been no one officially charged with Georgy Markov's murder. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.